Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I hear a lot of chipper good mornings, and it's a beautiful morning, not weather-wise. It's beautiful to be in here honoring such an important story. My name is Melissa Brown. I'm the director of the Buffalo History Museum, and I am delighted to be part of the program this morning and welcome you all to the Buffalo History Museum. I just want to mention, because we have a full program, before we get started, a couple housekeeping pieces. Our restrooms are available on this floor right outside in the gift shop and also downstairs on the lower level. And also, while you're here, I know the students, did you get a chance to see Mary Talbert's portrait this morning? Yeah, so if you are walking around the museum during the program later today and you want, Mary Talbert's portrait and her Spingarn medal are upstairs as a feature in our Continuum exhibit, as well as many other amazing women's stories. But if you have a chance to go see those, I would recommend you doing that. It's now my honor to introduce Lily Wiley Upshaw with the Michigan Street Corridor to continue our program this morning. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. So please allow me, on behalf of the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor, we welcome you to our Women's History Month event, honoring, saluting, reintroducing Mary B. Talbert. We have a wonderful program planned for all of you, and I hope that you all are as excited as I am to engage in the topic of learning about this phenomenal woman. And I'm so happy that we have been able to, the corridor, to launch this event in collaboration with committed members of our community. And so at this time, I'd like to recognize them and have our collaborators to please stand. First, Melissa Brown, who's already introduced herself, from the Buffalo History Museum. Karen King, Commissioner of Public Advocacy, Erie County, Office of Public Advocacy. Dr. Barbara Seals Nevergold, co-founder of the Uncrowned Queens Institute. Dr. Lillian Williams, who will be our guest and featured speaker today. And Janelle Stevens, who's a senior at City Honors High School. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Terry Elford, our Executive Director of the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor Commission, and he will also offer his words of welcome. Terry?
Thank you, Lily. And good morning, everyone. Now, you know, history shows us that behind any great idea or movement, women have served as the foot soldiers, its instigators, the leaders and provocateurs of real transformational change for the better. On behalf of the Heritage Corridor Commission, as well as our founding cultural anchors, I am proud to be a part of this great event as we celebrate iconic women representing our community. When I look at the audience, and I especially see our young people here, and I'm buoyed by the fact that one of the things that we are all obligated as leaders, as historians and preservationists, if you will, as parents or just lovers of kids and young people, that we're obligated to do these type of things in order to stimulate interest in our history, no matter what your need, what makes you unique or what makes your family unique. It's important that we do these type of things in order to really stimulate the appreciation of everyone's culture, especially ours, as we celebrate Women's History Month. So again, thank you all for coming and attending. And I'm looking for a great event, great program this morning. Aren't you all? Thank you.
Before we begin our program, I also want to recognize and say thank you to Ms. Jennifer Parker of Jackson Parker Communication. She's the person extraordinaire who's been the energy and arm behind getting this program launched for us, and we just love working with her. And also our program manager, Audrey Clark, who some of you met at the registration table. Now, we also have some wonderful, before we start with our official program, we were fortunate enough to declare this Mary Talbert Day. So we have some proclamations to present. And this is astonishing. So we have a proclamation from Congressman Brian Higgins' office, and this will be presented into the congressional record. So this is a high distinction for Mary Talbert, and the one of many that as a community we all plan to do together, and today is just the launching pad of more greatness to come. We also are honored to have members of the Talbert family with us today, and I would like for them to please stand to just be recognized. Working together, I know that we will keep Mary's legacy alive. And so at this time, I'd like to invite Ms. Evelyn Williams to come forward. She's the office manager for Congressman Brian Higgins. But we all know that when we say these titles, especially women who work, that's about this much of what we actually do. So we're very happy to have her come forward, as well as Dr. Williams, who will read for us the proclamation. She said it. There's always a little technical glitch, but we'll work it out as soon as I find my cursor. Huh? Where? Do you want to advance it? Yeah.
It's there, Melissa.
No?
It was there, right there. It's there.
Just proclaiming the day.
Yeah, we're proclaiming Mary Talbert.
Oh. I thought, you know, the proclamations are very long, so I thought there would be a slide with all the paragraphs.
No, we.
Excuse me.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins of New York, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the memory and accomplishment of Mary Morris Burnett Talbert, a civil rights activist, educator, and a historic member of the Buffalo community. She was an extraordinary woman who left her mark on Buffalo and across America. Today, I ask that you join me in remembering and honoring the life of Mary Morris Burnett Talbert, an incredible woman whose activism and heroism paved the way for a brighter future for so many and a more just society for all.
And next, I'd like to present to all of you again, Terry Elford, our Executive Director, who will read the proclamation from Mayor Byron Brown's office, City of Buffalo.
Thank you, Lily. I'm going to spare reading this entire proclamation, just for the interest of time. But whereas Mary Burnett Talbert was a renowned civil rights activist and educator who fought for human rights nationally and internationally during the early 20th century, and whereas Mary Talbert was a pioneer of international organization efforts whose work gave a voice to many black women and bridged the gap between 19th century abolitionists and the developing civil rights movement of the early 20th century, as Mary herself said, the greatness of nations is shown by their strict regard for human rights. Now, therefore, be it resolved that I, Byron W. Brown, Mayor of the City of Buffalo, do hereby proclaim March 31st, 2023 as Mary B. Talbert Day in the City of Buffalo in order to bring awareness and recognition to a key figurehead in the American civil rights movement. Thank you.
We also have one additional proclamation from New York State Senator Tim Kennedy's office, and I'd like to bring forward Zanetta Everhart, Director of Diversity and Inclusion. And she's also running for the Maston District Common Council seat.
Good morning. How are you today? Good. What a beautiful, beautiful day. I'm sorry about my tardiness, but I am running around being Tim Kennedy today. I'm taking all his meetings. He's still stuck in Albany dealing with the budget. So I am here today, and I'm excited to be here today because, you know, Mary Talbert. What do I say about that? I think Terry kind of summed it up with the mayor's proclamation there, so I won't read this all, but I will just present it to you because thank you, first of all, for all of the work that you all continue to do on behalf of telling these stories because they are so important, especially for our young people that I see here sitting today. We have to make sure that we're continuing to educate them about the history of our people in this city, and it's truly important. So just thank you very much, and I present this proclamation to you on behalf of the senator. Thank you. You're very welcome.
So later on today, we're going to transition and have a panel. And if any of you have ever watched The View, we're sort of mimicking that today. So we're going to be talking about Mary from very many perspectives, and we're going to have a guest in the form of Dr. Lillian Williams. But before and as we transition to our panel, I'd like to introduce to all of you and bring to the front Karen King. Karen is Commissioner of Public Advocacy for Erie County, Office of Public Advocacy and Executive Director, the Erie County Commissioner on the Status of Women.
Good morning, everyone. March 31st, the last day of Women's History Month, and how fitting that we are here to celebrate Mary Talbert. I'm very excited to tell you about a project that features Mary Talbert. The Commission on the Status of Women has embarked on a collaborative project. We have many community partners. It's called the Trailblazing Women of Western New York Monument Project. And we will be placing monuments of trailblazing women from Western New York throughout Erie County. The first 3 statues will be placed at Old County Hall, and of course one of them includes Mary Talbert. And the very renowned artist Finney Bagwell is creating the 6-foot bronze statue that we hope will be placed in early spring. This is a great way for us to commemorate, valorize, celebrate women. Because as we know, women are often hidden from history. And not only are they behind great ideas, they are the creator of great ideas. So when you walk around our community, you'll probably notice there aren't very many statues celebrating women. They're mostly of men, usually on a horse with a sword. So our goal is to change that. Mary Talbert was an instrumental figure in human rights as well as civil rights globally. And her stature and her commitment need to be recognized, not just for little girls, but for little boys too, for everyone to enjoy. And the beauty of the Trailblazing project is it is an accessible outdoor museum. These statues will be placed throughout our entire community for everybody to enjoy and to learn more about these incredible women. So I'm honored to be here today amongst fabulous women and the men that support the fabulous women. Thank you for being here as well. So we're going to get on with our program. Thank you for joining us. And we know that March is Women's History Month, but of course we celebrate women every day, 365, 24/7. Thank you.
So we're going to pretend there's a little commercial break while our panelists come forward. So I'd like Dr. Nevergold to come and sit at our panelist seat, Janelle Stevens and Melissa Brown.
welcome panel. I'm going to be introducing our esteemed guest of honor in a moment, but of course, Barbara Seals Nevergold. Dr. Nevergold is the co-founder of Uncrowned Queens Institute. Welcome to the panel. Lily, of course, Lily Upshaw, who you've heard from this morning, is chair of the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor and chair of the Buffalo Niagara Freedom Station Coalition for the historic Michigan Street Baptist Church. And Janelle Stevens is our senior from City Honors. Welcome, Janelle. And of course, Melissa Brown, who is the Buffalo History Museum's executive director. So welcome, panelists. We are going to be talking about Mary. We want to keep it somewhat conversational, but before we embark on that discussion, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, the brilliant scholar and Professor Lillian Williams. Please. So while Lillian's getting settled, she's going to give us a brief, professor, a brief overview of Mary, and then we're going to segue into the questions. You just tell us when you're ready, Lillian. Okay.
Good morning. I'm pleased to introduce to some of you Mary Burnett Talbert. Mary Burnett Talbert is a significant historical figure who's been lost for all intents and purposes, and recently there's been a resurgence in information pertaining to her and the important role that she's played in human rights efforts, not only in the United States, but abroad as well. So I want to talk a little bit about her family. Talbert, first of all, was born in Oberlin, Ohio. And Oberlin was a significant town. In 1866, when she was born, her parents had actually purchased land in Oberlin a decade or more before the Civil War broke out. They had wanted to bring their children to Oberlin so that they could take advantage of the opportunities, the educational opportunities, because Oberlin was founded as a town by liberal Christians who essentially wanted it to be a sanctuary for escaped slaves and freeborn African Americans. And by the time of Talbert's birth, the African American population was 1/3 of the town. But it was there. Her father, Cornelius Burnett, was a barber, affluent, freeborn, of freeborn parents. Her mother was also a business person that operated a restaurant and a boarding house that catered to the Oberlin College community, also freeborn of freeborn parents. So that's her heritage on, on the Talbert side of the family, the maternal side of the Talbert family. And it was important for them to send their children to Oberlin College, and all of the Burnett children did. Mary graduated at age 19, became a teacher, went into Little Rock, Arkansas, where she taught for several years before becoming the bride of William Talbert of Buffalo and moving to Buffalo. Without getting into the details that I had made note of, I think I'd like to have them come out when my panelists ask questions. So why don't I stop here and let the panel take over? Lily?
When we had the idea for putting this panel together, again, I watch The View and love it. And so that's sort of the flavor we want to have today, is that we want to have a conversation with you, about Mary and sort of bring her to life for everyone else to just kind of get a sense of her. Whenever I look at Mary, I'm astonished about the work that she was involved in her life, Dr. Lillian. Like, she was just everywhere. She was on the international stage. She fought for women, the whole NAACP connection. So could you talk a little bit about how just give us a little taste of the kinds of the activities that she was engaged in and what kind of person she was? Like, how did she find the energy to do all of that? Who was she? What's the essence of her?
I can't answer.
Okay.
I would love to gain some of that as well. But I think it's important, the family background that I talked about earlier helps to set it up. Her parents were actively engaged in their communities through several institutions. One was the Congregational Church that they were members of. The father also was involved in Republican politics, attended a number of conventions that focused upon securing the ratification of the 15th Amendment. And they were involved in benevolent organizations like the Order of Eastern Stars or the Masonic Order. So these skills, Mary grew up in a household where these skills were paramount, and she learned from her parents as well as from her older siblings. So that was the basic foundation, a commitment to service to those to whom more is given, more is required. And that was a mantra for them.
Janelle, you want to take our question, our first question? Go ahead.
So Mary Talbert is known like simply as one of the best colored women in history, but in Buffalo and even around the world, she's not even like well known for her contributions, which have proven to be so influential, especially to Buffalo. So why do you think she isn't well known, especially like in the Black community?
I think it's important for us to note when historians conduct research, we need primary sources. Talbert died very young. She died at age 57. And when you compare her activities with some of those of her peers, for example, people like Mary Church Terrell, who were involved in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, as was Mary Talbert, or if you look at Anna Julia Cooper, who was a student at Oberlin at the same time that Mary Talbert was a student. Cooper lived to 105 or 107. So they had longevity when Talbert didn't. They had written extensively, publishing autobiographies or leaving a bulk of papers to document their activities. Unfortunately, that was not the case for Talbert. And also they had advocates in terms of their children. In terms of Mary Talbert, her daughter died too. A small family, one child, Sarah Mae Talbert Keelan, who was a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music and followed her mother as she traveled throughout the United States, throughout the Caribbean, and throughout Europe. But all of those materials have been lost or still hidden, I'll put it that way. And I'm still searching. And every day I find something. In fact, just this week, someone sent me a cache of materials on Mary Talbert. I was excited to receive this material. I had no idea that it was coming. So the word is getting out by traveling and talking about Mary Talbert. People are listening and understand the importance of this 20th century reformer who was deemed by some as the most important female reformer in Buffalo during the first half of the 20th century.
You know, we're here today to talk about and accentuate Mary Talbert's life and what she did and what we don't know about what she did. But we also, and I know you have been and I have been working to dispel, you know, a misinformation about Mary Talbert that continues, right, continues to percolate on and on. So would you, for this audience, please clarify what Mary Talbert's role was in the founding of the Niagara Movement of 1905?
I'd be happy to do that. And listen very carefully.
Yeah, that's set up.
Mary Talbert was active in several women's organizations. The Empire State Federation of Women, she was a president for 2 terms. She was vice president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and ultimately became president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and served for 2 terms. But she also was one of those individuals who founded the Buffalo branch of the NAACP. And the forerunner of that was the Niagara Movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the leaders in the formation of the Niagara Movement, contacted William Talbert to ask him if he would host the 27 men who were coming to Western New York to meet to found the organization. And Talbert became the local arrangements person. He invited them, and they met at William and Mary Talbert's home. Now, as Barbara said, the myth associated with this is that Talbert was a founder. At the time, women were not permitted to become members of the Niagara movement. Therefore, she wasn't. But I'm here to tell you this morning that I doubt seriously that she was baking cookies and serving.
Lillian, it makes me think about, so I have spent half of my life actually this year here at the History Museum. I was 24 when I first started, and I know vividly that's the first time I ever heard about Mary Talbert. And it was during research preparing for the Pan American Exposition Centennial exhibit, and it was the first time that her story came into, my consciousness, to be honest. And I grew up in Niagara County, and so I knew about Belva Lockwood, who's another story that's kind of lost to time. And I remember in meeting you and learning about the Negro exhibit at the exposition, but then also more broadly, her story. And I think what strikes me about history and what I've always been passionate about it, even before I started working here, is that there's this one historian who says, the moment just past is extinguished forever, save for the things made by it. And when you talked just a minute ago about primary sources and Mary Talbert's story, I mean, the urgency to me of understanding like that historic preservation piece, and if we don't save these things, if we don't intentionally document our own stories and ensure that they are kept somewhere, even with technology now, with digital resources, they are lost. In your research travels, what is like one of the most marked moments in learning about her story for you, or one of those really cool like encounters?
There are so many, but the thing that strikes me right now is when I discovered that she was an organizer of an organization called the International Council of Women of the Darker Races. Now, this organization was extraordinary. Mary Talbert, as president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, had been involved in the International Council of Women. In fact, she was the first official African-American delegate to that convention, which met in Norway. And she spoke for the council and stressed the importance of addressing human rights issues, colonialism, and of course, Jim Crowism in the United States and the impact that it had. But as Talbert appealed to those women who were representative there and who were the spouses, in most cases, of very prominent men, including kings, there was still a need for African-American women to stress the importance of rights for people of color around the globe. So the International Council of Women did just that. It brought together women from China and other parts of Asia, from West Africa. It included women from the Caribbean, African-American women, and indeed the indigenous population. And that was a very progressive organization whereby they wanted to address those disparities which they face based upon race and heritage for all intents and purposes. Did I do it all?
Absolutely. I mean,
What year was that? When did that happen?
Yeah.
When was that? Like what
I'm
years?
sorry.
What years?
Was
Like,
the
yeah.
1922,
1922.
1923, yes.
right. And I can say most everything that I've learned about Mary Talbert, I've learned from you, Lillian. Truly, and Dr. Nevergold and Sharon Holly when we worked on African American literary societies, and the Mary Talbert, even her advocacy for other women's stories at that time, and making sure, like the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and making sure that other stories were ensured. But I am very grateful, but I think there's that profound piece that just strikes me of how if you don't have these contacts, you can lose those stories. And I think Mary Talbert is arguably one of the most important people to come from, not just women, but people to
mark this region's story.
Sure. Yeah,
Make sure that Janelle has an opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you yourself, you're an extraordinary woman. I mean, you've had so many opportunities, and your contributions to the understanding of African Americans, especially African American women, like Mary Talbert, has been so influential. But what was it that made you want to like make this your life, like make the understanding of African Americans so like prominent in your life? What was it for you?
I guess there are two ways to respond to that. First of all, I'm the firstborn in my family, and my father was my hero. Everything my dad read, I read. My dad collected newspapers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier. He introduced me to J.A. Rogers. I was fascinated by these stories because they talked about black kings and queens. They talked about explorers, scientists, people that I had never heard of by this time I was only in first grade, so I hadn't been in school a long time. But I hadn't heard about any of these. They weren't being discussed in my classroom. So I decided that I would educate my fellow students because I thought they were as bored with Dick and Jane as I was. but I was surprised by the response I got from my teacher. My first grade teacher told me that my father's books were a pack of lies and I should not bring them to school anymore. I never told my father. That's the one thing I regret. I never told him what happened. When he asked if I wanted to bring more books, I just said, well, other kids have to bring books, so I can't bring them all the time. But that whole notion stuck with me. Why are these stories not told, and what can the impact of these stories be? So I had another incident in 8th grade. My English teacher wanted to teach such stories, but related that she couldn't, that she would get into trouble. So she told me that my job would be to teach the students. She had us go to the library to conduct research, and we had to do oral presentations. She also taught me a lesson that I was to learn when I became a teacher. If you put it on the exam, they'll learn it. So the materials that I taught were on the exam. So I would talk about Phyllis Wheatley after having read about her and others of that ilk. And then by the time I went to college, it was the civil rights movement, and I saw learning African American history, learning indigenous people's history, women's history, could impact policy. And I argued at that time, perhaps somewhat naively, that if they only knew the story, they would be receptive to change. So that's basically what got me to doing what I'm doing. And in the case of Mary Talbot, it was hubris. I had been invited probably a month after graduating with my doctorate. I was invited to do a paper at a women's history conference, only I hadn't done anything in women's history. But I remembered Mary Talbot. Whenever I was conducting research for my Buffalo study, I found Mary Talbot, whether I was looking at presidential papers, whether I was looking at social institutional records, there was Talbot, or if I were looking at government department records, there was Talbot. So I remembered her, and I said, who is this woman? She's omnipresent. So I accepted the invitation, despite the fact I had done no research. And I said, you know, how difficult can it be? It's only 10 pages. I can write that in a day. Well, you have to have documents in order to write the 10 pages, and I didn't. So I changed my paper title to My Quest for Mary Talbot.
So before we open it up for questions from the audience, so be thinking, what do you think, how do you think Mary would reflect on the times, you know, that we're in now?
I think she would be disappointed on the one hand, but I think she would be encouraged by the fact that there are elements that are still working for human rights, and especially among young people. She believed that we needed to train the next generation of leaders, and she was always involved in programs for young people.
That's great. That's great. And I do want to
Let me just say, too, history and preservation were important for her, too. You know, preserving the Douglas estate. She worked tenaciously to make that happen, raising money. Even when she went to Europe to work with black troops, they contributed $1,000 for her to bring back to the United States to purchase the Douglas estate and to preserve it. And Talbert emphasized that it needed to be done because our children need to know who fought for their liberty.
That actually is another question that I did have too, Dr. Williams. What happened in preserving Mary's home and her legacy?
There was a movement back in the 30s to actually do that, but it failed. So as you know, there's a landmark now. Her church, her house was next door to the Michigan Avenue Baptist Church, and there are markers now. In fact, I am also a member of a commission, a National Vote for Women's Trails, that has approved a marker to be established at her Northland home on, 118 North, and she owned 118 and 116 Northland Avenue. So that's been approval, and we're just waiting now for the owners to grant permission for the marker to be placed on the property.
Can I ask a question too? I know you want to
Yep.
go to the audience,
ahead.
but you alluded to it just now when you talked about her addressing the troops going in World War I. And she lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But the fact of the matter was that she took her message far and wide, and the travel that she did. Could you expand on that, you know, in terms of the work that she did that took her outside of Buffalo and New York State even?
It's just extraordinary, the numbers of miles. If there were frequent flyer miles and she was traveling by train at that day, it would have been just extraordinary. In fact, I remember asking someone why they were in California working on a project on Mary Talbert. And the response was, do you know how many schools in California are named after Mary Talbert? And I said, no, I don't know. But I've discovered that there are schools, there are colleges named after Mary Talbert. A hospital in Cleveland was named after Mary Talbert, Women's and Children's Hospital, later merged to become Cleveland General Hospital. But she traveled and she lectured extensively all over town, towns throughout the country. She went into places like Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana. These were sites of great violence against African Americans. And yet she was able to do it under the auspices of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, because all of you club women know that all you do is to wear fancy hats and you hold teas. So that enabled her to actually come in and organize chapters of the NAACP, for example.
Oh, so she came in and they're thinking, oh, it's just ladies
That's
having
right,
tea.
ladies
So
don't, you know.
no harm, but yet she was agitating and doing all that work, but in this
Absolutely.
guise of, it's just the women having some tea.
Right.
Okay. Oh, there was another point you just brought up too, when you talked about at the time when she was doing all of this was the violence that was happening to African Americans in the country. And I know she also had a hand in the anti-lynching campaign. So can you talk a little bit about that, you know, what she was doing in that area too?
Sure. First of all, lynching had been a major crime that arose essentially after slavery ended. It, in essence, was a means of controlling black progress in terms of seeking human rights and constitutional guarantees. So that had to be squelched. During Reconstruction, for example, even the state of Mississippi had 2 African-American senators, if you can imagine. Mississippi, my home state, 2 African-American senators. So to destroy black attempts at self-actualization, lynching emerged. And also the NACW, National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, had conducted a number of campaigns to try to get Congress to ratify bills to make lynching a federal crime. The story that was told was that lynching occurred because African American men had raped a white woman. And what's interesting, those studies show that rape was seldom ever mentioned, and also 25% of the people who were lynched were women. So it was to crush Black self-determination, economic growth, development, education. Black schools were burned. Some states, like South Carolina, Louisiana, implemented what they call a shotgun policy. When African Americans stood in line to vote, whites came in with shotguns and killed them. That was the policy. So the NACW was concerned about these mass lynchings of Black people, and they organized continuously. In the latter part of the 19th century, Ida Wells Barnett particularly, who was a friend of Talbert's as well, had traveled and published and even went abroad to get Europeans to support their endeavors to make lynching in the United States a federal crime. It failed, of course, and then with Talbert as president of the NACW and also as a board member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, led this movement to seek federal legislation. And that, of course, failed as well when Congressman Dyer introduced it in Congress. It was not ratified. And interestingly enough, Congress just last year, almost 100 years to the day when Talbert led her campaign, enacted the federal anti-lynching bill. It's the Till bill, actually.
For audience members? Don't be shy.
I feel like I'm cheating, but because I have been working along with them so much, and I am just amazed of Mary Talbot. This woman was a human rights advocate before it even was cool. One thing is, I would love for you, and I know I don't need to give you any more work, Dr. Williams, but you were mentioning the Douglas estate, and there are people that don't know about that story about Frederick Douglass. We probably need the Phyllis Wheatley Club and the Women Club, so maybe we need a follow-up fact sheet that we can put on the Michigan Street website. I'm giving you some work.
We can make it happen, I'm sure.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Good morning, Dr. Williams. We're all aware of the hatred and vitriol that's coming out of the state of Florida, where the governor actually had the nerve to say that African American history has no educational value. As a prominent historian, how do you answer, these outrageous claims, and how can we fight back against this? I just, it makes me angry just to even think about it. How do we counter, this narrative, and how do we fight for the educational rights of our children who need to know this history, and also other children who need to know it as well, since African Americans were a prominent part of building this country for free, and we deserve to have our history highlighted like everyone else.
I'm going to go back to Mary Talbert and the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, because it was very interesting with that. I mentioned the various groups of people, the nations that were represented, but what was also important, these women came from different cultures, they spoke different languages, they didn't know each other. So the first thing they did was to create courses so that they could learn their languages, learn about their cultures, and ways that they could work together. And I was struck when I went through the papers of the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, there was a syllabus prepared for African American history that I could have used in my classes. Obviously, I would have had to update the bibliography, but the themes, the questions that were raised were the same. So I think it's important for representation. If you put babies together, regardless of who they are, notice how they react to each other. They see that they're different, I think, from the older parents that have them. So teach them about each other. You can do it at very young ages, maybe teaching them songs, having them interact with one another, and it's important to have that representation at all levels.
Good morning. My name is Jessie Ector, and I am a member of the Mary B. Talbert Club, established in 1974 in Buffalo by Mrs. Carolyn B. Thomas and Mrs. Mary Chappelle. I'd like to give thanks to Lillian Williams and Barbara Nevergold and the whole panel. Every time I attend one of your sessions, I learn so much, so I thank you very much. We are the only club that is still in existence. We were one when I joined the club in the 1990s. There were several clubs in New York State, and here in Buffalo, New York. But in Buffalo, Rochester area, we are the only club left. So I'm hoping that we can establish some more clubs and keep Mary B. Talbert's name alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'd just like to say something since you mentioned Carolyn Thomas. Carolyn Thomas was instrumental in my being able to preserve the records for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is the oldest African-American institution that is in existence today. So that was of critical importance to write some of those stories because these records were, in disparate places, in the homes of individuals and indeed in the council. But it took efforts, and because of Carolyn Thomas's advocacy and introducing me to a board member of the National NACW, I was able to get them, and they're preserved. They're certainly at UB, and there are other repositories too for those of you who might be interested.
Another question?
Yep. Hi, I just had a question with how you stress the importance of storytelling and preserving that through history. Do you find that in today's society with social media and how quickly stories can be, the perspective can be completely changed, do you find it harder as historians to keep accurate storytelling going into the future?
I'm not the person to ask about the social media because I don't use it, I must admit. But I like the fact that stories can get out quickly, and if there were a way for us as scholars to get our stories out to those audiences, I would love to reach a few million people here or there to give them accurate information about what took place in our recent history.
I think that's a question that Melissa or Dr. Nevergold could also address.
Yes, it is definitely, I think it's definitely more difficult to get information out because it can definitely be easily skewed by different perspectives, by just like people really will believe anything they say on the internet. So I think that it's important to make sure that, it's important to, like as a collective, to make sure that you know how to research and how to understand when information could be skewed or not. That's the whole point of being a historian. You have to kind of access different perspectives, and it's important, even if you're not a historian, to understand that historians have to access things from a certain perspective. Like, you're a black woman, you're doing things, you're understanding things from the perspective of a black woman. Of course, it might be a little different if there is a white male trying to portray the story of Mary Talbert. So I think that as a collective, as humans, we have to understand, especially if we use social media, how to kind of determine and how to analyze when this might be skewed a little bit or this might be a little biased, and that's how we can kind of develop our own opinions on things when we understand that it is coming from different people.
I think using it as a point of entry for like anything that you're seeing out there, if it can hook people to get more interested, I think what you're positioning, Janelle, is that aspect of doing your own research and then for different places like the Michigan Street Corridor to be resources to help people, find the way, because sometimes that can also be the hook, like, hey, I didn't realize this, and getting people engaged, like you're saying at wide mass, but trying to deal with the fact that there's a lot of misinformation out there as well.
Also, I think following up on Janelle's comment about information being easily skewed, I mean, certainly that happens, but correcting that information is really difficult. And so, it's incumbent upon us, I think, when we see something that is not correct, that we try to correct it, because otherwise the misinformation goes on and on. There's so many different platforms in which to tell the stories, and certainly for those of us who are trying to make corrections in inaccurate and mythological information, and particularly those of us of a certain age that don't have the facility with with the social media and so forth, trying to keep up with all those different platforms. I don't know TikTok. I mean, I'm still with Facebook, and I understand young people don't use Facebook, do you? No, they use TikTok. So anyway, I think there, as has been explained by the panel, both pluses and minuses to consider in terms of using the social media platforms to replicate the stories. Right.
And to that end, I'm so excited, Dr. Lillian, just to be here, and I can't wait for your book to come out. And so I really think this could be a weekly radio show where you're talking about Mary B. Talbert, frankly. Curious two things. One, when is a statue or a bust being erected to Mary B. Talbert? And two, can you talk a little bit about her relationship with Madam C.J. Walker and anything that you know about that? Because, there's so many women and so many connections that happen here in Buffalo that we don't know anything about. And so.
Well, Karen King mentioned earlier in regard to the statue that we're expecting it in the spring of next year. So keep apprised of what's going on there. In terms of Madam C.J. Walker, she was a very important figure. First of all, her story is literally one from rags to riches. So I'll summarize it by saying that. But she was very concerned and involved in human rights issues. And she worked very carefully and closely with Mary Burnett Talbert to help her implement some of her projects. In fact, if you look at the philosophy of Madam C.J. Walker, a third of her profits went to civic engagement types of activities. She was convinced that that was essential. In terms of Talbert's leading the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign, she made the first contribution, $500, which was a lot of money in those days, to that campaign, and she worked with Talbert on all of her initiatives.
Good morning, everybody. This is too exciting for me. I feel like crying. But I just love everything I'm hearing. One thing that has occurred here in Buffalo, I'm very proud of it. I am in real estate, and there was a young lady who became the president of the Board of Realtors after 119 years. So we have changes happening, but it takes a long time for it to occur. I'm so proud of her, and she's African American, very proud of her. The other thing I have is that recently, in terms of our children, there was a young lady on TV, they had it on TV, and she had to do a report with regards to history. So she chose Bessie Coleman. The teacher said, oh no, she's not that important. So of course she cried in the class. Her mom heard of it, and her mom worked in the Civil Air Force piece. She gathered her with people from her job, and that's how she read her poem. So there's some changes happening, but she cried, and I said, things are still changing, but not fast enough for the people that are teaching our children.
And I arrived in Chicago about a year ago at the airport, and my taxi driver took me from the airport onto Bessie Coleman Way, and I felt at home.
I have a question. I'm curious about her death and dying at 57. She was a great collaborator. Did she have projects that she wanted to accomplish that others took off? Is there evidence of that? And did she know she was going to die, or was it sudden?
She was ill for a year, according to the sources that I've had. She had coronary heart disease, so she died. But I think her biggest accomplishment in her mind was to preserve the Douglas estate. She actually dedicated that in the summer of '22, and she also was able to pass that on to a future generation. She also had been able to have other preservation activities like not Phyllis Wheatley, the Harriet Tubman, thank you, Harriet Tubman statue. So she wanted to make sure that the next generation knew about these activities. And I think she was happy with the kinds of things that she had done. She, of course, would have liked to have seen the dire anti-lynching bill enacted, but that remained for another 100 years, and I'm sure she's smiling now.
Hi, Lillian.
Hi, Barbara.
Thank you all for putting together this wonderful panel. This is the second time in a month that I've sat in this room to hear about the wonderful continuing work that you all are doing. I was here for the latest unfolding of the Uncrowned Queen's work about a month ago, Barbara, Peggy. And it's upstairs now, so, you know, when we're wandering around betwixt the meals, we can see it there. One of the things I heard that night that was so striking that's echoed today is the extraordinary internationalist consciousness of African Americans in this country. The context the other day was in terms of a very early recognition in the African American community of the fascist threat in England during the middle of the 20th century. And of course, you stress the internationalism of the early 20th century today. I just wonder if you'd want to reflect a little bit on that, the scope of that kind of consciousness in the African American community.
I think that Mary Talbot and her generation of reformers understood the implications for colonialism, whether we're talking about in Africa, whether we're talking about the Caribbean, but they realized that their fates were inextricably intertwined. So they worked tenaciously to overthrow or to influence policy that would improve those conditions. Talbot wrote to rulers in Belgium, for example, about the treatment of their subjects in Africa. She also was instrumental in getting the atrocities that were perpetrated against Haitians by us, by the United States, brought to the attention of the authorities so that something could be done about these. So they realized that they had to fight on all levels, that simply freeing African Americans or people from a specific country or even continent for that matter wouldn't end the atrocities that were being perpetrated. And they hoped to win the support of other groups. For example, the International Council of Women was one of those groups that they hoped to win over. And as I indicated earlier, they were basically speaking truth to power because their husbands were the kings and other rulers of those nations. I didn't see Peggy back there.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram, co-founder of the Uncrowned Queens Institute with my long-term friend and colleague, Barbara Neverlord. I want to tell you what is going on here. Part of that is that we have a circle of queens here. How many people here are uncrowned queens?
All of
Sharon,
them.
Sandy, Jennifer, and what's extraordinary about that is that,
Peggy, pull the microphone up, please. Thank you.
and what is extraordinary about this circle of queens, while we may not talk to one another every day, what has happened here is that there is a picture that we can put together. I can start with Lillian Williams, who was on my dissertation committee when I did a second doctorate on a woman who knew about Mary B. Talbot. That was Drusilla Dungy Houston. Lillian was also on the dissertation committee of another uncrowned queen named Robin Hicks. Robin Hicks was a person who was writing about Murray Crosby Chappell, who was a member of the Mary B. Talbot Club. And not long ago, in fact, maybe 10 years ago, a woman named Sylvia Wright, who is also one of our uncrowned queens, came to my home and gave me a packet of materials and said, Robin Hicks is dying, and she's in Lillian's department, and she wants me to give you her information on her dissertation because she wants you to finish writing it for her. The circle got crazier and crazier and crazier, and we wind up ultimately at the Buffalo History Museum, looking again at women who did extraordinary things. The lady behind me spoke about the Mary B. Talbot Club, and the person who was a big leadership person in that club was Murray Chappell. And Murray Chappell was the woman whose birthday we celebrated, her 100th birthday, almost 10 years ago or less. One of the people who contributed information to me to be able to put together the story of Murray Chappell was Sharon Holly. Sharon Holly gave me written materials that she had put together with Marcus Brown. And so this is a historic occasion for more than one reason. And the primary reason is that the History Museum has helped to put together, bring together a group of women who may not have seen one another over the last 10 years, but we know one another. And so this is really a big deal to have Lillian here, right in the center of this, right in the center, talking about someone that we know the most about through Lillian. And then 10 years ago, right in this room, a Sloan's representative of the Sloan's family, who were Jews who had escaped the Nazi concentration camps, presented to me and Barbara with Uncrowned Queens the Michigan Avenue Church outside directory that he had collected when the Fruit Belt was being torn. And so we all sit here as a member of a whole group of people telling a story, and some of us learning for the first time, and others of us hearing for the first time. But it is extraordinary, I think, this circle of queens that we can actually identify. And so for young people, I say to you, if you have an opportunity to follow us even more closely, there's so much more that you can learn. And I thank Lillian.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Those were wonderful words in which to conclude this portion of our program. But as we get ready to transition to the brunch, I hope that the conversation won't stop. that questions can still be shared and we can still fellowship together. I'd also like to recognize the Buffalo Public School students that have joined us today, and Dr. Fatima Morel, another partner and collaborator with today's event. And before we leave this room, we do have some door prizes, so I'd like you all to just kind of look underneath your seat. If you see a little card with the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor logo on it, then you will have won one of our door prizes. And as you exit, Audrey will be sitting at the table and she'll hand you your door prize. The students, we have something special for you to do. And as you go down, there are no assigned seats. However, we do have a table reserved for the Talbert families, table number 1. If you need elevator, there is an elevator in the museum that'll help you get to the next level.
And we want to have a banquet. And I remembered some years ago when the Urban League had an anniversary. You did, actually. I guess Bill was still the executive director.
Lunch will be held in the, can I have everybody's attention, please? What is it called?
Lower level of the museum? At the Hyatt Regency. And I wondered if you'd be interested in.
When you exit this room, you're going to go to your left, and you'll see a set of stairs, head down, and then you'll see the tables. Exit the hallway to your left, you'll see a set of stairs to your right, exit down, and that's where the brunch will be held.
It's going to be next year, I think it's 23rd of
Not
May.
enough time, never enough time, right?
Okay, well, we should, and you've met Tony, right? Who does exhibits here?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I can get you. Tony, I think that we could have space. Oh my gosh, Karen says website.
Right. Great.